At 0640, the mountain air at Buckhorn Ridge Training Facility cut sharp through the lungs. Snow still clung to the north slopes despite spring orders, and boots crunched over gravel as a half-dozen sniper candidates gathered around their gear near the staging zone. The usual pre-mission tension buzzed in the air until someone pointed and laughed. It started when Elena Torres stepped off the Humvee. No uniform, just a sand-colored field jacket and dark jeans tucked into old boots. Her rifle case looked like it had been dragged through 3 wars, and the sling over her shoulder was frayed cotton webbing, not the padded carbon-stamped stuff the others carried. One of the corporals nudged his buddy and said loud enough for everyone to hear that she must have taken a wrong turn out of the museum. She didn't flinch, just scanned the range like she'd been there before and walked toward the benches, boots steady, posture upright. When she unzipped the case, the Remington 700 inside was even older than expected. Bolt action, woodstock polished smooth by time. The optic mounted on top looked like a Bushnell from the 1980s, capped turrets and all. A chorus of snorts rippled through the group. Staff Sergeant Hal Bennett stepped forward with a smirk. He was all tactical black, from his Oakley gloves to his cry pants, the kind of guy who ran drills even in the gym. He crouched beside her gear, pointed at the rifle, and said, "If that thing still held 0, he'd eat his NVGs." Another guy offered to lend her a ballistic app, because judging by the leather notebook she pulled from her pack, she still did her calculations by hand. One joked that maybe she was writing poetry, not dope sheets. Elena kept quiet. Her hands moved with slow precision as she tightened the sling and wiped the scope lens with a cloth. There was no apology in her silence, no flinch in her movements. She checked the bolt, looked through the optic, and clicked the elevation knob exactly 3 times. Then she sat down on a bench away from the others and opened her notebook, writing something small and neat without glancing around. Captain Marcus Ray watched from the edge of the range, arms crossed, face unreadable. He'd been briefed that a civilian specialist was being added for observational training, some experimental cross-program thing from the DoD. He hadn't expected her to show up alone, with old gear and no rank. But what struck him more than her gear was how little she reacted to the noise. Most people would have gotten defensive, or at least rattled. Instead, Elena was still, too still for someone untrained. She didn't seek approval, didn't try to correct anyone, and that, more than anything, made Ray narrow his eyes. He turned to the sergeant major beside him. "Do we have her full file yet?" The older man shook his head. "Just a clearance code. No service record. No deployments listed. Just that she's cleared for live fire and full range access." Ray nodded once. Slow. Then he looked back at Elena Torres, still scribbling calmly in her book, and for the first time that morning, something in his expression shifted. He wasn't laughing. Not anymore. At 0710, the convoy crept up the logging trail that carved through the eastern slope of Snowcap Ridge. The fog hung low, veiling the upper peaks like smoke. Pines thinned out as they climbed higher, giving way to patches of bare rock and frozen moss. By the time they reached the temporary firing post at 9,300 feet, visibility was cut to under 200 meters. No one spoke much as they stepped off the trucks. The cold did enough talking. Captain Ray stood at the center of the small group, his voice cutting through the morning haze. "No cowboy shots today. No tech magic. Every round is logged. If you fire, you better be damn sure what you're shooting at." He looked around until his eyes landed on Elena. She stood slightly off to the side, her rifle slung diagonally, notebook tucked under one arm. "You'll be solo for this one. Miss Torres." No spotter. She nodded once without a word. The group took positions across the ridgeline, each shooter assigned a unique lane. Elena's was farthest to the north, where the wind funneled through a narrow chute between 2 cliffs. While others unpacked their kestrels and digital scopes, she crouched down and placed a small folding mat on the gravel, smoothing it with gloved hands. She laid her rifle down, adjusted the bipod by feel, and opened her book. Private Ruiz squinted in her direction and nudged Bennett. Seriously, no LRF, no tablet. She gonna send a raven to calculate wind speed? Bennett didn't bother whispering. He turned and said maybe she'd chant the bullet into the target. Even a few of the quieter shooters smirked. No one expected her to speak up, and she didn't disappoint. Elena never looked up. Her eyes stayed on the ridgeline, lips moving silently as she mouthed something only she could hear. She wrote down a number, then a correction. Captain Ray watched from behind his binoculars, jaw clenched. He didn't stop the jokes. He just waited. Because if there was one thing years of combat had taught him, it was this: the quiet ones were always worth watching. At 08:22, the wind shifted again, coming in sharp from the southwest. The temperature drop was enough to create visible shimmer across the canyon floor. Most of the team had given up trying to calculate a clean shot. The Kestrel readings kept changing every 15 seconds, and the digital ballistic apps were throwing warnings. Sergeant Bennett's screen blinked red. Probability of impact, 9%. Elena lay prone near the north edge, the barrel of her Remington 700 resting just below a scrub of frost-bitten sagebrush. She had no digital readouts, no laser rangefinder, just a page full of notations, symbols, and a steady breath. She adjusted her scope 3 clicks, then paused. She didn't look through it yet. Instead, she closed her eyes. One breath in, half out. She opened her eyes and settled into position. The range marker confirmed target silhouette at 2702 meters, a man-sized steel plate, partially obscured by morning glare, crosswinds at 2 layers, mirage distortion heavy. No one else dared fire. Elena did not hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. No flourish, no dramatics. Just one clean motion, and the muffled crack of a suppressed round cutting through fog. The recoil lifted her shoulder slightly, but she remained motionless. 2 seconds passed, then a faint ping echoed across the valley, followed by the metallic flutter of a distant impact flag. Dead center. Nobody spoke. Ruiz stared through his scope, then lowered it slowly like he'd forgotten how to use his hands. Bennett blinked twice, frowned, and checked his screen again. No way, he muttered. That shot shouldn't be possible. Captain Ray lowered his binoculars. His mouth was open, but no words came out. He looked at Elena, who was already scribbling something else in her notebook. She hadn't even smiled. She just reached into her pouch, pulled out a second round, and chambered it without a sound. The silence that followed felt heavy. Not awkward, not confused. It was the kind of silence reserved for witnessing something no one was ready to explain. At 20:45, the mountain winds had settled, and the generator hummed low outside the canvas command tent. Captain Ray sat behind a folding desk, lit by a single red-lensed lamp. The air inside was warmer than outside, but not by much. A pot of black coffee steamed quietly between them, untouched. Elena stood near the back wall, hands resting at her sides. She hadn't asked to be called in. He hadn't ordered her in front of the others either. It was just the two of them now, away from the noise, away from the jokes. Ray leaned forward, elbows on the desk. That shot today, it wasn't just good, it was clean, perfect, decisive. He didn't phrase it as a compliment. It sounded like a challenge, like he needed to know if what he'd seen was real. She didn't respond immediately, just studied the tent flap as it fluttered in rhythm with the wind outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady. I've done shots like that before, just not where anyone was supposed to notice. Ray frowned. You served? Didn't you? I checked. Your file is basically redacted. Civilian clearance. But your posture, your gear prep, that notebook, that's not amateur stuff. She looked at him for the first time since entering the tent. Her eyes didn't flinch. I was attached. Temporarily. Quiet units. Long time ago. Mostly not written down. That's not a denial, Ray said. It's not confirmation either. She allowed the smallest trace of a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm not here to impress your team. I'm here to see if any of them are worth teaching. So this is a test of them, of all of us. Ray sat back, exhaled through his nose. He watched her as if waiting for more, but she offered nothing else. No timeline, no unit, no explanation, only the occasional weight behind her words, the way her hands never fidgeted, and the precise way she stood, like someone who knew where every exit was. Before she turned to leave, she paused near the entrance. You ever fired under blackout rules, she asked, not turning back. Ray nodded slowly. Once, Kandahar, 2009. Elena nodded once. I remember that night. Then she stepped out into the cold, leaving him staring after her, wondering how much more he didn't know. At 2217, the barracks were mostly quiet except for the low hum of a shared laptop and the occasional clink of a metal water bottle. Sergeant Bennett, Ruiz, and Hallie huddled around a screen in the corner of the common area, their voices low. It had started as a joke. Ruiz had pulled up archived sniper records for entertainment, but then something odd appeared. It was a mission log from a blacked-out op in 2014 file tagged as training validation footage. No chain of attribution. The record described a confirmed hit at 3:12 meters under high crosswind in northern Iraq. The weapon listed was a modified Remington platform. No shooter named, just one blurred photo. Likely captured by thermal drone footage. Hallie leaned in, squinting at the screen. Wait, that's the same notebook. She pointed at the image. Tucked into the shooter's side pouch was a leather-bound logbook, brown edges, curved spine, exactly like Elena's. Bennett didn't say anything right away. He just stared at the shape of the shooter prone, one leg cocked outward for stability, the way the scope rested slightly forward on the rail. The rifle was nearly identical to hers. Same aged wood, same minimalist modifications. His smirk from earlier that day was gone. Ruiz scrolled through the metadata. No GPS tag, no unit ID, just a note shot verified by satellite timestamp. Wind at 17 knots, mirage distortion high. Confirmed kill. Bennett leaned back, jaw tight. He didn't speak for several seconds. When he did, his voice was low. We laughed at her. All day. Every damn hour. Hallie looked at him sideways. You think it's really her? He nodded once. Doesn't matter if I think. I know. No one makes that shot twice unless they've lived it before. He stood up without another word, leaving the others to stare at the frozen image on screen. The grainy silhouette wasn't clear, but it didn't need to be. Sometimes the absence of detail is what makes the truth louder. At 05:30, the ridge was quiet except for the scratch of graphite on damp paper. Elena stood beside a whiteboard propped up against a stump, drawing wind layer diagrams with a pencil stub. The others watched from folding stools, eyes still fogged with sleep. Sergeant Bennett sat in the back, with arms crossed, half listening, half waiting for her to say something he could call out. She didn't. She just kept talking in a voice calm enough to draw attention by contrast. The wind you feel on your face isn't the wind your bullet travels through. Between you and your target are at least 4 different altitudes, each carrying its own direction, density, and temperature. She handed out hand-drawn worksheets showing how to estimate wind drift by terrain shadow. By 06:45, they were hiking out to a secondary training zone. Elena stopped at a bend in the ridge and pointed to the snowmelt line. See how it stops short of that cluster of rocks that tells you the wind wraps around the outcrop like water in a stream. Your bullet curves with it. Bennett squinted. Or it hits turbulence. She nodded. That's the real reason you miss. Later that morning, she had each of them lie prone and do nothing but observe for 30 minutes. No firing, no calculations. Just watch the mirage roll off the valley floor, the way light bent over distance, how the trees shifted below cloud cover. She timed their breathing with a metronome and asked them to match the rhythm to their trigger press, even when they weren't holding a rifle. By the second day, Bennett's attitude had started to shift, not because she called him out or proved anything with words, but because the rounds he sent at 200 meters began landing closer. His groups tightened by inches. He started asking questions, small ones at first, then more. Elena never made a show of his improvement. She just walked past during his dry fire drills and adjusted the angle of his wrist or told him to reset his dope from scratch because the wind had shifted from layered shear to lateral gusts. He'd look up, blink, then realize she'd seen it before he had. On the third morning, she handed him a strip of colored ribbon and told him to tie it to his suppressor. He raised an eyebrow. "Visual index," she said. "Just watch how it flutters when you're breathing right." By noon, his holdovers were nearly perfect. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like fog lifting. Bennett no longer interrupted, no longer joked. He started showing up early, checking his gear twice, and watching the horizon before anyone else had their scopes out. At 18:10 that day, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, he stayed back after dismissal. He didn't speak at first. Then, as she packed her rifle, he said without looking at her, "I used to think sniping was about control, about the rifle. Now I think it's about listening." Elena didn't answer right away. She just nodded and said, "It's about knowing what matters at 2,000 meters. Then she walked off, leaving him alone with the silence. At 06:05, the group gathered on the overlook where the terrain opened wide into a horseshoe valley. Mist clung to the rock faces, and the rising sun painted gold across the far ridgeline. Elena stood at the edge, one hand resting lightly on her scope. No one spoke. They waited. Now. Not out of formality, but respect. She crouched and pointed to the wavering distortion just above the valley floor. "You see that shimmer? That's mirage. Most think it's heat, but it's not just temperature. Its density changes in air layers. And that shimmer," she said, "tells you how thick or fast those layers are moving. Not where the bullet will land, but what it's about to travel through." Bennett leaned forward slightly. "So it's not just wind." She shook her head. "Wind is like a rumor. It changes with who you ask. What matters is how it moves through the world. Think of the space between muzzle and target not as empty, but as a river, flowing, bending, changing. If you try to force your shot across it, you'll fight the current. But if you understand the current, you can ride it." She motioned to Ruiz and had him kneel. She pointed out how the mirage tilted left near the ground but stayed upright at the mid-level. That means the lower wind is pushing west, while higher up it's split by terrain. She asked him to sketch the pattern in his log. Then, she had them line up and breathe deeply with eyes closed. Feel the shift on your skin. Which cheek warms faster? That tells you your angle. Listen to the trees, not the apps. Your ears will warn you seconds before your gear does. Bennett muttered something about never trusting his gear again. Elena didn't scold. She smiled faintly and said, "Trust it to tell you numbers, not truth." By mid-morning, they practiced dry runs with wind calls based only on mirage and local movement. No devices. Hallie correctly called wind shear by watching the movement of crows near the ridge crest. Elena nodded in approval. Animals always know the air first. They moved again to a narrower canyon where cross-drafts were known to ruin shots. Elena fired once, then asked the team to explain why it landed low right. After 2 wrong answers, Bennett finally said, "The humidity dropped and that patch air got thinner. Less lift." Elena tapped her temple, and the air felt sharp just before. You have to feel it. You can't always measure it. At 10:40, as they packed up, Ruiz asked quietly what she called this kind of shooting. "It's not just math," he said. "It's something else." Elena looked out across the canyon for a long time before answering. "At this range, bullets don't just fly, they navigate. It's not marksmanship, it's translation. You're reading a language written in wind, light, pressure, And patience. That's long-distance shooting. Not control, not dominance, just understanding. At 14:25, the secure comms channel lit up inside the forward command shelter. A tech sergeant from Intel slid a tablet across the table to Captain Ray. His expression clipped. Reaper just lost telemetry. Last data shows it dipping off the flight plan over grid. 8G07, right over the high ridge near Wolf's Basin. Ray narrowed his eyes. That's drone airspace. What's it doing that low? The screen displayed satellite overlays and flight path deviations. The MQ-9 Reaper, launched out of Creech AFB, had been on a high-altitude surveillance pattern. 30 seconds before losing signal, it dropped 200 feet and began a slow bank before cutting out entirely. No system faults. No weather interference. Elena entered silently, glanced once at the screen. Not a malfunction, she said. That's soft interference. Jamming pulse, maybe localized. Ray didn't argue. A moment later, another analyst entered, holding a brief from NSA Relay. Group flag near that area. Independent militia, testing new anti-drone optics, possibly laser designation or portable jammers. Not confirmed. Command had seen enough. Ray stepped outside and called his team in. They were briefed fast. No filler. Here's the situation. We've got a group playing games with our recon birds. Intel says they're mounting anti-air kits in a high canyon. They're trying to bait us. We're not taking that. He turned to Elena. We need a shot. Public. Tracked. Drone will be back in the sky to catch it from above. Command wants them to know exactly how far we can reach. Elena didn't blink. Range. Just shy of 3,200 meters. They're on a slope with partial tree cover and high wind exposure. Static targets for now. Might move by dusk. She didn't hesitate. I'll need 2 others. We'll fire as one. Record it. Stamp the footage. Ray nodded. Already cleared. This won't be hidden. This one's meant to send a message. Elena turned and headed for her gear. The team followed. There was no need for motivation. No hype. Just the clean, cold atmosphere of real-world engagement. The kind that didn't care about drills or scores. The kind that only ended with either silence or smoke. At 15:10, the map was already pinned to the operations board. Topo lines, wind corridors, and sight lines were marked in red grease pencil. Elena stood in front of it, flanked by Captain Ray and 2 comms specialists. Her voice was level, no dramatic tone, just clear directives. We set 3 firing positions, 1 west on Ridge 9, 1 south on the granite shelf above Wolf's Basin, and 1 east facing through the Saddle Pass. Distance to target is roughly 3,170 to 3,210 meters depending on position. The goal is synchronized impact, not just fire. 3 shots. 1 result. Ray nodded. Drone footage rolls from above. This goes public. We want them to see it coming and still not stop it. Elena pointed to the team lineup. I'll take position 3. Bennett, you're on 1. Hallie, 2. Each spot gives you a different wind profile. No devices. Full manual calcs. Bring notebooks, optics, range charts. Your gear will be cached tonight. You'll hike in pre-dawn. No comms until final setup. Caspian will coordinate fire timing remotely, using satellite sync and drone relay. Hallie raised a question about terrain concealment. Elena answered without looking at notes. You'll have overhang. Use local stone for cover. Avoid thermal contrast. Ditch anything that reflects. You're not hiding from people. You're hiding from sensors. Bennett adjusted his sling and nodded. Got it. East Ridge will be rough on breath control. High angle. Mirage bounce. Elena glanced at him. Then compensate early. Fire ahead of the bounce line. Don't chase the shimmer. Predict it. Logistics moved quickly. Ammo was matched and verified. Each rifle inspected, then tuned with consistent barrel harmonics. 0 checks were performed individually. Then dry run simulations with a timing metronome. On Elena's count, they drilled squeeze pressure with dummy rounds. 3 clicks, 3 holds, 1 fire. Caspian finalized drone relay algorithms to broadcast the command pulse for simultaneous shot. Elena reviewed the math. She recalibrated each fire solution by hand, adjusting for microclimate between slope face and valley wind rotation. No shot was perfect, but the alignment of 3 made perfection plausible. By 1850, the team dispersed to prepare gear and ration packs. No one raised concerns. No one asked for backup. They knew what this was. A strike not just for damage, but for signal. And when Elena laid the final strip of acetate over the map, she circled the target zone once, then said, quietly, "We hit. They scatter. They learn. And we vanish." At 0542, the sun crept over the ridgeline like a blade sliding from its sheath. The air was still sharp, the kind that bites through gloves and dulls trigger fingers. Frost clung to the rocks on Ridge 9. Bennett lay prone, wrapped in ghillie netting, watching the valley below through his scope. He tapped his earpiece once to confirm signal, then stilled. Hallie was already set on the granite shelf. She adjusted the elevation knob on her rifle and squinted against the shimmer of heat rising from the dark stones. Far to the east, just beyond the saddle pass, Elena finished her final wind call. She'd watched the way the dust twisted at the base of the basin, then traced the ripple in the tree line. Her notes were open beside her, but she didn't need to look anymore. At 06:05, Caspian's voice broke through their comms, crisp and even. All shooters in position. Target convoy approaching compound. ETA 1 minute. Synchronization locked. Stand by. Elena didn't reply. She adjusted her cheek weld, exhaled slow, and centered the reticle. From her angle, she could see the clearing where the convoy would stop. Her scope picked up faint thermal signatures, warm bodies inside the lead truck. She whispered the distance to herself. 3,106 meters. Wind at 6 knots. Low shift east. Hallie steadied her breathing, counting seconds between inhales. Her gloved finger rested lightly on the trigger. Bennett adjusted slightly left. His target sector overlapped Elena's just enough to provide redundancy. Through their scopes, the target emerged. 3 men stepped out of the truck. One wore a dark field jacket with a red band near the collar. He walked into the open, speaking to others in the second vehicle. This was the Mark, a field commander known for coordinating drone interference zones. The drone overhead locked visuals and began recording. The timestamp started. Caspian's voice again. Final confirmation. Fire on Mark. Synchronization in 5, 4. Bennett's heartbeat slowed. He blocked out the cold, the pressure, the weight of consequence. Hallie's breath hitched. Elena's grip never shifted. She didn't look away from the glass. She simply said, "Quiet now." 3, 2, 1, Mark. 3 suppressed reports cracked near simultaneously. The sound didn't echo. It just disappeared into the morning air like it was never there. The valley was still for a beat. Then the target staggered. No flinch. No warning, just dropped mid-step, knees folding under, head snapping back. Chaos exploded. The surrounding men scattered, ducking behind vehicles, weapons drawn. But there was no second shot. No visible threat. No enemy in sight. Caspian's voice cut in. Target down. Impact confirmed. No secondary shots. Maintain concealment. Begin exfil. Bennett held his scope steady. Watched as confusion spread below like a wave. Hallie blinked hard. The silence after was louder than the gunfire. Elena had already pulled back from her rifle, calmly logging a note in her book. At 06:09, each shooter began dismantling their setup. Caspian initiated drone withdrawal. The footage was clean. 1 synchronized shot, no flashes, no muzzle trace, just an impossible reach turned into undeniable impact. Elena packed her rifle last. She didn't speak, but as she secured her case, she paused and looked out at the basin one more time, not to admire the shot, but to make sure the wind had carried the message. Then, she vanished into the rocks. At 0940, the dust from the extraction helicopter still lingered in the air above the landing zone. The team had returned in silence, each carrying more than their packs. The compound strike had gone clean. Too clean. No missed shots. No visible trace. Just A single perfect, broadcasted message that was already circling back through encrypted intelligence channels. Inside the debriefing tent, Captain Ray stood with arms crossed as Bennett and Hallie settled into the folding chairs across from him. Elena remained standing near the back, as she always did. Detached, but present. Ray exhaled once and said what none of them expected to hear. This wasn't just about that target. The department had eyes on all of you. On her, specifically. Bennett glanced at Elena, who remained expressionless. Ray continued. She wasn't brought in to assist. She was sent to assess. Silence followed. Then Hallie said, "Assess what? Potential for something that's not supposed to exist anymore." Ray walked to the table, tapped a closed folder with no name on the cover. The ghost program. Not the myths you hear about online. The real one. It was shut down after Kandahar. Too many unknowns. Too much deniability. But now, after what just happened, they're reactivating it. And they want Elena to lead it. All eyes turned to her. She didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, she shook her head. "I'm not leading anyone." Ray didn't argue. He just asked, "Why?" She met his gaze evenly. "Because ghosts don't give orders. They teach. Then they disappear." Bennett leaned forward. "So you'll train us. If that's what you want, I won't tell you what this path costs. Only what it gives. And that most of the time, no one will ever know what you did." Hallie looked down at her hands. "I think that's the point." Ray nodded once. "Then you'll stay on as cadre." Elena paused, then gave a single nod. "I'll stay, but only until you can do this without me." She walked out of the tent without another word. As she passed the flagpole at the edge of camp, a breeze caught the canvas above it. The only sound left was the quiet flapping of nylon in mountain wind. Behind her, the three young shooters sat still, not because they were waiting for orders, but because they all understood the same thing at once. The mission wasn't over. It had just changed shape. At 07:15, the morning sun stretched long across the gravel yard of the new training site nestled in Nevada's high desert. Dust floated behind the boots of incoming recruits, their gear slung heavy, eyes still unsure. Among them was a young woman with dark braids tucked into a faded ball cap. She carried a rifle case that looked older than she was, canvas wrapped and worn at the corners. A couple of trainees nudged each other as she walked past. One chuckled and said something about pawn shops and museum exhibits. She heard it, but didn't slow, just found her assigned bench, laid the case down, and began setting up like it was the most natural thing in the world. The moment her bolt clicked open, the chatter paused. Something in the way her hands moved unhurried, methodical, almost familiar shifted the energy around her. From the far side of the yard, Bennett stepped forward, no rank on his chest, just dusty sleeves rolled to the elbow. He watched for a moment, then spoke without raising his voice. "Let's see what she can do." The other trainees went quiet. She didn't look up, just nodded once and continued checking her elevation. Off in the distance, beyond the bleachers and concrete barriers, Elena stood near a wind flag. Her arms were crossed, her face shaded by her brimmed hat. When the first shot rang out and hit center steel, she didn't cheer or speak. She smiled. Not wide, not showy, just enough to soften her eyes. Because she'd seen it before. The way the cycle begins again. A quiet girl with old gear, a room full of doubt, and then the truth, sharp and undeniable, breaking through the noise like a single shot across empty space. By 07:20, the range was silent again, not from command, from respect. And somewhere in the rising heat, a new kind of legend had just begun to form.